It was 2:47 a.m. when I sat up in bed. Heart pounding, room quiet, too quiet. I wasn't startled by a nightmare, or some sound outside the window. It was something else, a feeling, a question, a silence that didn't feel empty, but heavy, like someone was waiting for me to notice. I had gone to bed restless, with the weight of 100 unspoken thoughts pressing against my chest. Life had not been particularly cruel, but it had become loud. Loud with expectations, loud with opinions, loud with my own doubts. I had everything I once thought I wanted: a stable job, an apartment in the city, weekends full of friends and social plans, yet I felt disconnected. Not just from people, but from something deeper, something eternal. And so, at 2:47 in the morning, I sat in the darkness and whispered, "God, are you there?" It wasn't the first time I'd asked. I grew up in a Christian home, said prayers before meals, knew the stories of David and Goliath, of Jonah and the whale. But what I had never learned, not really, was how to hear God's voice. How to know when He was speaking, or whether it was just my own thoughts echoing in my head. That night, I didn't hear thunder, no burning bush, no booming voice from the clouds. But something inside me shifted, the kind of shift that makes you decide, not from pressure, not from guilt, but from hunger, that you're going to start seeking. Not casually, not in a 5-minute devotional before coffee, but earnestly, deeply, like your soul is on a quest to remember something it has always known, but somehow forgotten. This is the story of what happened when I chose to listen. Not just once, every day, through confusion, through silence, through small wonders and big questions. This is the journey of learning what it means to connect spiritually, of discovering that hearing God's voice is less about volume, and more about presence, less about the words, and more about the whisper, and how that whisper can change everything. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't dramatic, like the way you feel after a life-changing event. It was more subtle, like when you wake up and the air just feels clearer. Or when you hear a song you haven't heard in years and it brings something unspoken to the surface. I went through the motions: coffee, emails, traffic, small talk, but all the while, there was this gentle ache in my chest, not painful, but persistent, like homesickness for a place I couldn't name. I realized I wasn't just longing to hear God's voice. I was desperate to feel seen by Him again, or maybe, to see Him at all. That evening, I found myself walking into a church I hadn't been to in months. It wasn't a planned visit. I was just out for a walk, and somehow my feet brought me there. The doors were open, though the lights were dimmed. Only a handful of people sat scattered across the pews, heads bowed, some whispering prayers under their breath. I slipped into the back row, hoping not to be noticed. The quietness was overwhelming, not the kind of silence that makes you fidget, but the kind that feels sacred, like the air itself was holding its breath. I closed my eyes. "God," I whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know how to hear you, but if you're here, I'm listening." Nothing happened, no sudden warmth, no spiritual revelation, just stillness. But I stayed, and in that stillness, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not the kind that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that comes when you stop running from God, from yourself, from silence. That night, I began a simple habit. I called it listening time. No phone, no music, no distractions, just 10 minutes a day of sitting still, eyes closed, heart open. At first, it was awkward. My mind wandered. I thought about emails I hadn't replied to, laundry I needed to do, conversations I replayed in my head. I felt like I was failing, like spiritual connection was some test I kept flunking. But slowly, things began to shift. The first thing I noticed wasn't a voice. It was awareness. I started to become more aware of the present moment, the texture of the air, the rhythm of my breath, the tension in my shoulders. I noticed how often I was anxious, even when nothing was wrong. I noticed how hard it was to simply be. And in that awareness came an invitation, not to do more, but to let go. I started asking questions in the silence. "God, why am I always so restless? Why do I feel like I have to prove myself all the time? What do you want to show me about who I am?" I didn't hear answers in words. Not yet, but the questions themselves became a doorway. One morning, during my listening time, a thought came to me so gently. It felt like it floated in from somewhere else. You are trying to earn something I already gave you. I opened my eyes. My heart raced. I don't know if that was God's voice or just my own mind. But something about it rang true. Deeply true. That one sentence stayed with me all day. What if the reason I couldn't hear God clearly was because I was trying too hard? What if He'd been speaking all along, but my own striving had drowned Him out? I began reading the Gospels again, not as a religious exercise, but as if I were meeting Jesus for the first time. I was stunned by how often Jesus went off alone, into the wilderness, up the mountain, into the garden, to pray, to listen, to be with the Father. If the Son of God needed silence to connect, how much more did I? I started carving out more time, not just in the mornings, but in quiet moments throughout the day, on walks, during commutes, even at my desk. I'd pause and take 3 deep breaths, silently praying, "Speak, Lord, I'm listening." And slowly, the noise inside me started to quiet down. Not all at once. There were still days of doubt, still moments when silence felt like absence. But I was beginning to see that the journey to hear God's voice didn't start with sound. It started with surrender, and that changed everything. There's a kind of silence that feels like a void, empty, aching, unsettling, but there's also a silence that feels like a womb, protective, still, alive with unseen growth. That's what I began to discover in those weeks of quiet. God's silence wasn't absence. It was invitation. At first, I thought hearing God would be like tuning into a divine frequency, a voice from above telling me exactly what to do. But what I was learning instead was that hearing God often comes through the slow transformation of our awareness. It's not always a sentence. Sometimes, it's a shift in perspective, a softening of the heart, a sudden understanding. One afternoon, I took a walk through a nearby park. The trees were half bare, their golden leaves drifting to the ground like pieces of time letting go. I didn't have earbuds in. No music, just wind, footsteps, and the occasional crunch of gravel under my shoes. And that's when it hit me. The more I practiced stillness, the more I noticed beauty. Not just outer beauty, though that was part of it, but inner beauty, a quiet, reverent appreciation for life itself, for the breath in my lungs, for the fact that I could walk, feel, wonder. It wasn't that life had become easier. My work was still demanding, relationships still complex, and questions still unanswered, but something inside me was changing. I no longer needed everything to be resolved to feel peace. I was beginning to recognize God's voice not in answers, but in presence. One night, I journaled a question: God, what are you trying to teach me in this season? And as I sat in silence, pen in hand, words began to rise in my spirit, not loud, not forced, just a flow of thought, calm and clear. You cannot hear me clearly when you're always trying to fix everything. Let me meet you in the middle of the mess. I stared at the page. Tears welled up in my eyes. So much of my life had been performance, not just for people, but for God. I thought being spiritual meant always being strong, always knowing the right thing to say, always having faith at full volume. But what I was learning was that God's voice often speaks clearest when we stop performing and start being honest. So I started to be honest, brutally honest. In prayer, I stopped editing my words to sound holy. I told God when I was angry. I told Him when I was confused, bitter, or scared. And somehow, in that raw vulnerability, I began to feel closer to Him than I ever had in my most spiritual moments. I started to realize, God isn't waiting for the perfect version of me. He's speaking to the present, messy, half-healed me. And in those raw conversations, I began to notice something new: guidance. It wasn't always direct or immediate, but I would feel nudges, small, quiet impressions that felt like peace leading me somewhere. Once, I was about to send an email I had drafted in frustration. Something told me, wait, not a dramatic stop, just a pause. I closed the laptop. The next morning, I rewrote the email with clarity and kindness, and it led to a breakthrough in a strained relationship. Another time, I felt a deep urge to call an old friend I hadn't spoken to in over a year. I almost didn't. It felt random, but the feeling wouldn't go away. When I finally called, she answered in tears. She had just lost someone close and had prayed moments before for someone to reach out. That's when I started to truly believe. Hearing God doesn't always come as words. Sometimes, it's a whisper in the form of timing. a gentle pull, a holy coincidence, a truth you didn't know you needed until it arrived. And each time I obeyed those small nudges, the connection grew stronger, not because God became more present, but because I became more aware. I began to ask myself daily, what am I sensing beneath the surface? Where is the peace? Where is the resistance? What would happen if I trusted that quiet voice inside? Not every day was profound. Some days, I felt distracted, restless, or simply tired, but I kept showing up, to the silence, to the stillness, to the waiting, because somewhere deep down, I was no longer seeking answers. I was seeking relationship, and relationship isn't built in fireworks. It's built in the ordinary, in trust, in presence, in the willingness to be known and to listen without demanding a response. Little by little, the way I moved through life began to shift. I walked slower, I listened longer, I spoke with more intention. I worried less about being right and more about being aligned, with grace, with peace, with God. I still didn't have all the answers, but I was finally starting to hear the whisper, and the whisper was enough. There's a misconception that spirituality is something that only exists in moments of deep emotion or divine intervention. We often imagine that God's voice must be accompanied by extraordinary circumstances, a burning bush, a loud declaration, a sudden epiphany, but I was beginning to see that, for most of us, the voice of God comes not in thunder but in a quiet stillness. It is the stillness that asks us to wait, to listen, to trust that even when we can't hear, God is present. I had learned this the hard way, through trial, error, frustration, and ultimately surrender. The more I tried to force things, the less I heard, the more I demanded answers, the more distant they seemed. But when I finally let go of control, when I stopped trying to manufacture God's voice and just made space for it, I started to hear it more clearly. One evening, as I sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about how much time I had spent chasing after answers, seeking validation, trying to prove myself worthy of God's attention. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. God's love doesn't depend on my performance. It's not about being good enough, perfect enough, or worthy enough. It's about being present. The truth is, we are often so caught up in the noise of our own lives that we miss the stillness that God is offering. We mistake silence for emptiness, and in doing so, we fail to recognize that silence is where the soul finds rest. I had spent so much of my life running after accomplishments, always trying to do more, be more, prove more, but in those quiet moments, when I stopped everything, I began to realize that God wasn't looking for me to do something. He was looking for me to be still, to be present. I think about how often we struggle with the idea of silence. We fear it because it feels uncomfortable. We fear what we might find in the silence, our fears, our insecurities, our doubts. We fear that without the distractions of the world, we will be left alone with ourselves. But it is in that very space of silence that God can speak the loudest. It was in this silence that I began to feel a deeper connection to my own soul. I began to recognize patterns in my thoughts, emotions, and desires, and, in doing so, I also began to recognize God's guidance within them. The stillness didn't just quiet the external noise, it also quieted the noise within me. One afternoon, as I sat in the park, I realized that the most significant shift in my life had come not from an overwhelming spiritual experience, but from the simple act of stopping to listen, stopping to feel, stopping to be present. The world was still moving around me, but for a brief moment, I had stepped out of the frenzy of life, and in that moment, I could hear God's voice more clearly than I ever had before. There was no lightning, no sudden rush of emotion, just peace, a deep, abiding peace that settled in my chest, in my soul. It wasn't a feeling I could explain, but it was a knowing, a certainty that, despite the uncertainty of the world, I was held, I was loved, I was seen. It wasn't just that I had learned to hear God in the silence. It was that I had learned to trust the silence, to trust that even in the moments when I couldn't hear anything, God was still at work. I began to see that the quiet moments of life are where God's most important work is often done. In the moments when we feel the least active, the least productive, God is preparing us for what's next. The shift was subtle, but profound. My days didn't magically become perfect. There were still struggles, still doubts, still moments of fear, but now, I had learned to hold those moments with a different perspective. I knew that even in the chaos, there was a stillness within me, a stillness that I could return to any time. It was no longer about chasing after answers, but about trusting the process, trusting the timing, trusting that God was present in every moment, even in the quiet ones. This peace wasn't something I had to force. It was something I could simply receive. And in receiving it, I was able to move through my day with greater grace, greater patience, and greater confidence. I wasn't striving to achieve peace, I was simply allowing it to flow into me, trusting that it would fill the spaces where I had once felt empty. As I continued on my journey, I began to realize that this process, this slow, steady learning to hear God's voice in the silence, was not a one-time event. It was a continual practice, a daily return to stillness, a moment-by-moment choice to listen. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes, the noise of the world felt overwhelming again. Sometimes, I doubted whether I could truly hear God's voice at all. But each time I returned to that stillness, each time I allowed myself to be present, I felt God's presence all the more. I think the most important lesson I learned was this: God's voice doesn't need to compete with the noise of the world. It is not loud, not demanding, not impatient. It is gentle, like a whisper in the wind. And if we are willing to listen, truly listen, we will hear it. The strength of that whisper is greater than any storm of life. And in it, we find the courage to keep going, even when we don't know what's ahead. We find the peace that passes understanding, not because our lives are perfect, but because we know that we are held by something far greater than ourselves. There's something profoundly unsettling about waiting. In a world that runs on immediate results, fast food, instant messages, quick fixes, waiting feels almost unnatural. We are taught to strive, to push, to act. The moment we feel like we are standing still, we begin to panic, as if we are wasting time. But I've come to learn that some of the most sacred moments are hidden in the waiting, in the quiet spaces between action and results, in the time when nothing seems to be happening, but something deep within is shifting. After weeks of practicing stillness, I realized that waiting wasn't just a passive experience. It was an active part of hearing God's voice. We tend to think that waiting is a sign of inactivity, that if we aren't getting answers, we aren't doing enough. But waiting, I discovered, is a kind of listening. It's a willingness to be present without demanding immediate results. It's learning to trust that in the quiet, something is still happening. It was in the waiting that I began to understand a deeper truth: God's timing is not my timing. I had spent so much of my life asking for things, answers, clarity, direction, and expecting them to arrive on my schedule. But God's voice doesn't operate on my timeline. And the more I tried to rush Him, the more I felt disconnected from His presence. I remember one evening, sitting by the window again, watching the rain fall in steady sheets. I had spent the day feeling frustrated. There were so many unanswered questions in my heart, so many areas of my life where I felt like I was waiting for something to shift, for some big revelation to come crashing down. But nothing was happening. The silence was overwhelming, and for the first time in a while, I began to question whether I was truly hearing God at all. In that moment, I felt a gentle nudge, like the softest whisper within my spirit: trust the process. I stared at the rain, unsure what that meant. Trust what process? The one where everything is still uncertain, the one where I don't have the answers, the one where I'm just waiting? But as I sat there, something inside me started to settle. It was like a weight lifted off my chest, and I could breathe a little easier. I didn't have to know everything right now. I didn't have to fix everything, or rush to the next thing. I could simply be. That night, I learned that trusting God doesn't mean having all the answers. It means resting in the truth that He is present, even when it seems like nothing is happening. It means trusting that the silence is part of the journey, not a sign that I've been abandoned. The next few days were a blur of work, family commitments, and the usual hustle of life. But something had shifted. I wasn't as anxious about getting answers anymore. I wasn't constantly scanning the horizon, waiting for a dramatic sign. I started to notice the small things again: the way the sunlight broke through the clouds after the storm, the laughter of a friend over a simple cup of coffee, the way the world seemed to settle down when I allowed myself to slow down. I had always been afraid of the quiet because it felt like emptiness. But now, I realized that quiet wasn't empty at all. It was full of possibility. In the silence, I was learning to hear God's voice, not as a forceful command or a booming directive, but as a gentle presence, guiding me through the mess of life. It was the kind of guidance that didn't demand instant results, but offered peace in the waiting. I began to understand that waiting isn't just about being patient, it's about being present. It's about showing up, even when you don't know what the outcome will be. It's about trusting that God is working, even when you can't see the results yet. I started to look at the waiting seasons of my life differently. I used to see them as frustrating pauses, moments where nothing seemed to be happening. But now, I saw them as fertile ground, moments of quiet preparation, when God was working in ways I couldn't yet understand. It was in the waiting that He was shaping me, molding my character, teaching me patience, teaching me trust. Waiting also taught me something important about my own desires. The longer I waited for answers, the clearer it became that I didn't always know what I needed. I had been so focused on getting answers, on finding clarity, but now I understood that sometimes the best thing God can do for us is to withhold the answer for a time. He withholds it not because He doesn't love us, but because He knows that we need more than just answers. We need to grow. I had prayed for clarity, for direction, for answers, but as I waited, I started to pray for something else. God, make me ready for what You have planned, even if I don't know what it is yet. I don't think I'll ever fully understand how God works in the waiting. There are still times when I feel uncertain, when the silence feels too loud, but I've learned that there is strength in waiting. There is strength in trusting God's timing, even when it feels like nothing is happening. I've learned that waiting is not passive. It is active listening, active trust, and active surrender. And in the waiting, I've learned to hear God's voice more clearly than ever before. In the stillness of waiting, there came a moment, one that I didn't expect, when I realized that I wasn't just waiting for God to speak. I was waiting for myself to surrender. Surrender, I had learned, isn't a passive act. It's not about giving up or resigning oneself to fate. It's an active choice to let go of control, to trust that God knows better than I do, and to allow His will to shape my life, rather than trying to shape it myself. I had spent so much of my life trying to hold everything together, trying to control every outcome, every decision, every relationship. I thought that if I could just make the right choices, work hard enough, or pray the right prayers, everything would turn out the way I wanted. But as the weeks passed, and I learned to listen to the quiet voice of God, I realized that my need to control was actually keeping me further away from true connection. It was one evening, as I was sitting quietly by the window, watching the sun set behind the distant hills, that I had this realization: I could either keep fighting to control everything, or I could surrender and trust that God was already at work. The truth was, I had been afraid to surrender. I was afraid of losing control. I was afraid of what might happen if I let go of my tight grip on my life. What if things didn't go the way I expected? What if surrendering meant losing everything I had worked so hard for? But in that moment, I heard a whisper deep within me. Let go. I felt the weight of those two words, not as a command, but as an invitation to trust that even in the uncertainty, even in the unanswered questions, God was present, to trust that He would never leave me, never abandon me, even when everything seemed out of my control. I wasn't ready to fully surrender in that moment. I don't think anyone is ever completely ready. But I made a choice. I chose to let go of the need to control every aspect of my life. I chose to trust that God's plan was better than mine, even if I couldn't see it yet. In the days that followed, I began to notice small changes within myself. I became more patient with others, less anxious about my future, more open to the idea that life doesn't always unfold according to my timeline. The more I surrendered, the more peace I found in the midst of chaos. I wasn't constantly trying to fix things. I wasn't holding onto outcomes. I was simply present in each moment, trusting that God was working behind the scenes, even when I couldn't see the full picture. It wasn't easy. There were days when my fears crept back in. I still found myself trying to control situations, trying to make things happen according to my own plan. But each time, I was reminded of the peace I found in surrender. I didn't have to have it all figured out. I didn't have to have all the answers. I just had to trust that God was with me in the waiting, in the silence, and in the moments of surrender. As time passed, I began to see the beauty of surrender. It wasn't about giving up on my dreams or resigning myself to a life of mediocrity. It was about aligning my desires with God's will, about recognizing that He knows the desires of my heart better than I do. It was about realizing that true freedom comes not from holding on to control, but from releasing it into His hands. One evening, I received a phone call from a close friend. We hadn't spoken in months, but something prompted me to pick up the phone. As we talked, she shared some of the struggles she was going through, and I could feel the weight of her words. She was at a crossroads in her life, unsure of which direction to take. Her heart was heavy with uncertainty, and I could hear the fear in her voice. As she spoke, I found myself listening not with my own mind, but with my heart. I wasn't trying to offer solutions. I wasn't trying to fix things. I simply listened, offering encouragement and empathy. And as I listened, I heard God's voice within me, guiding my words. For the first time, I realized that I wasn't just trying to speak wisdom to my friend. I was letting God speak through me. In that moment, I saw how surrender can lead to greater purpose. By releasing control, I was able to hear God more clearly, and as a result, I could serve others more effectively. I wasn't trying to force my own agenda or impose my own plans on others. I was simply allowing God to work through me, trusting that His plan was far greater than mine. Surrendering to God didn't mean that my life became easier. It didn't mean that all my problems disappeared, but it did mean that I could walk through those challenges with a sense of peace. Knowing that I wasn't alone, it meant that I could trust that God was working in ways I couldn't always see, and that He would never leave me to face my struggles on my own. The more I practiced surrender, the more I realized that it wasn't just about big decisions or dramatic moments. It was about every day, every moment, every interaction. It was about choosing to trust God with the small things, the decisions I made at work, the way I responded to my family, the way I handled stress. It was about trusting that He was at work in the everyday moments of life, not just in the big, life-altering events. As I continued to surrender, I began to experience a new kind of freedom, a freedom that didn't come from having all the answers, but from trusting that God was in control. I began to see that when we let go of our need to control, we open ourselves up to receive God's peace, His guidance, and His love in ways we never imagined. Surrender isn't a one-time event. It's a continual practice, a daily choice to trust, to listen, and to let go. And in that surrender, we find a deeper connection with God, and a greater sense of peace that surpasses all understanding. As I sit here today, reflecting on the journey I have walked, the search for God's voice, the stillness, the waiting, and the surrender, I find myself in awe of the profound peace that has settled over my heart. It's a peace that, in so many ways, defies explanation, a peace that has brought clarity where once there was confusion, direction where once there was uncertainty, and above all, a deep sense of contentment that I hadn't known was possible. There was a time when I believed that peace was something I could control, that if I worked hard enough, prayed enough, or made the right choices, I would find peace. But what I've come to understand is that peace isn't something we can force or manipulate. It's not something that can be earned through effort or achievement. It is a gift that comes when we stop striving and simply rest in the presence of God. As I reflect on the moments of stillness that were so uncomfortable to me at the beginning, I realize that those were the moments where I was being refined the most. God didn't need me to perform. He didn't need me to be perfect. He simply needed me to show up. He needed me to make space for His voice, to be still enough to hear it. The first time I truly understood this, I felt a wave of humility wash over me. I had spent so many years trying to achieve, to prove myself, to make something of my life. But in the silence, I learned that my worth was not tied to what I accomplished or how others saw me. It was tied to the simple truth that I was loved by God, no matter what I had or hadn't done. I can remember the first time I felt God's love in the deepest part of my soul. Beyond the thoughts, beyond the striving, beyond the noise. It wasn't a dramatic event, like I once expected. It wasn't a vision or a burning bush. It was a quiet knowing. It was in the stillness, when I allowed myself to be fully present in that moment, that I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if God was gently whispering to me, "You are enough. I have always loved you." It was then that I realized that the most important voice to listen to isn't the loud, boisterous one of the world. It's the quiet, tender voice of God that speaks deep into our hearts. and I had spent so much of my life not listening to it, trying to drown it out with noise, with distractions, with my own fears and insecurities. As I learned to listen to that voice, to trust it, to follow it, something incredible began to shift within me. I began to feel less pressure to live up to the expectations of the world. I began to release the need to compare myself to others, to measure my worth by standards that were never meant for me to carry. Instead, I found a new sense of freedom, the freedom that comes from knowing that I am already loved, already accepted, already enough in the eyes of God. I realized that peace doesn't come from the absence of struggle, but from the presence of God in the midst of it. It's not about life being perfect or everything working out the way we think it should. It's about knowing that no matter what happens, we are not alone. God is with us, in the waiting, in the struggle, and in the silence. In the past, I used to think that I had to earn God's love or approval. I thought that if I didn't get things right, if I made mistakes or failed, that somehow I would be left behind. But now, I know that God's love is unconditional. It's not based on my performance or my perfection. It's simply given to me, freely and completely. And so, as I sit here now, I feel at peace, not because everything in my life is perfect, far from it, but because I have learned to trust God's plan for me. I have learned that I don't need to have everything figured out. I don't need to know every answer. All I need to do is keep showing up, keep listening, keep trusting. The more I let go of my need for control, the more I have found peace. The more I surrender, the more I am filled with His presence. And as I continue on this journey, I know that there will still be moments of uncertainty, moments of struggle, moments when I don't have the answers. But I no longer fear those moments. I no longer fear the silence or the waiting, because I know that in those moments, God is working. I have come to realize that God's voice is always there, even when I can't hear it clearly. It's not about me making it happen, it's about trusting that it's already happening. It's about being open to the quiet whispers of God, trusting that He is speaking, even when the world around me is loud and chaotic. And so, as I move forward, I do so with a heart full of peace, a peace that is not dependent on circumstances or outcomes, but on the unshakable truth that God is with me, guiding me, loving me every step of the way. This journey of learning to hear God's voice, this journey of stillness, of waiting, of surrender, has transformed my life in ways I never could have imagined. It's not a perfect journey, and there are still times when I struggle, when I doubt, when I want to take control again. But I know that as long as I keep listening, keep trusting, and keep surrendering, I will continue to walk in the peace that surpasses all understanding. And in that peace, I have found the voice of God, not as a distant, elusive force, but as a gentle, constant presence, a presence that is always with me, guiding me, loving me, and reminding me that I am never alone.